Welcome to this audio session recording taken at the Agroforestry Show, which was organised in September 2023 as a partnership between the Woodland Trust and the Soil Association. For more session recordings, go to agroforestryshow.com or explore and subscribe to the Agroforestry Show YouTube channel. Enjoy!
Okay, we're going to make a start, so welcome everybody to this session. We've just briefly introduced myself, and then I'll sort of set the scene for the session, and then I'll introduce the speakers. So first of all, I'm Clive Thomas. I work for the Soil Association, and one of the things I've been doing over the last 12 months is project managing what's been called the Agroforestry Carbon Code project, which we're going to tell you a lot more about because we've just concluded the project. And the sort of main content, I guess, that we're going to be presenting to you is some of the technical information and some of the conclusions from the project. But as you'll see from the slide here and the title of this session, we want to broaden this out a little bit. It will become sort of evident, I think, from the fact that we've drawn certain conclusions that there is a sort of further question, which we're sort of setting up here in terms of what next for carbon finance for agroforestry implementation. So when we get to the Q&A, and we aim as a panel to only speak for about 45 minutes maximum, we really want to sort of hear contributions from all of you. I'm no doubt you'll have some questions for us in terms of the project, but any sort of wider contributions in terms of this question of what next would be really appreciated. So as I say, we've been running the Agroforestry Carbon Code project now for the last 12 months, and it's very much sort of positioned as a feasibility project. And I've got a slide in a moment that will, I guess, show you the key research question that we've been looking at. But just to introduce our panel today, you're going to hear a bit more from them when they introduce themselves, when they come up to speak. But we've got Colin Tosh from the Organic Research Centre, Helen Cheshire, who hasn't been very busy the last couple of days, so I thought she'd jump on this panel as well. So Helen's from the Woodland Trust and has been a core part of our project here, as well as making this fabulous event happen. And really great to see Andy Baker here as well from the Woodland Carbon Code, and why that's important. And that sort of relationship we've had with the Woodland Carbon Code will again becomes hopefully sort of evident as we go through the presentation. Just the project-y bits, I just want to tell you about the other partners because you've got myself from the Soil Association, you've got Organic Research Centre, and you've got Woodland Trust represented here. But Finance Earth have also been core project partners. Unfortunately, they haven't been able to field anyone today. They're a relatively small team. Somebody's on maternity and somebody's on leave. So they've given me a couple of slides to present on what their contribution was, which was primarily the financial appraisal. But also just to acknowledge, we did have some input from SRUC, Scottish Rural College, particularly Professor Mark Reed, who's quite well known in the voluntary carbon markets and the sort of development of standards and schemes. So he made a small funded contribution. But crucially, we then had two kind of advisory partners who worked with the project throughout the whole time that we were involved with this. So first of all, the Woodland Carbon Code team, that's a team that managed that code on behalf of the UK, so on behalf of the devolved countries as well as England. So we've got Andy here from the Woodland Carbon Code. And very coincidentally, our part of the wider Soil Association group, Soil Association Certification, who are very active in the validation and verification side of carbon schemes. We have had Andy Grundy, who also happens to be our tent manager for this session. I don't know whether that was planned or coincidence. So if there's any difficult questions on validation and verification, I might be calling on Andy, who's been involved with the project in an advisory way to help us think about those crucial validation and verification steps. Okay, just to introduce, I guess, the why. What have we been doing here? So this is the sort of the project question, really. So we've investigated the carbon sequestered by in-field agroforestry trees and the feasibility of that carbon to help generate upfront investment to facilitate additional agroforestry implementation. So we're at an Agroforestry Show here these 2 days, and obviously there's lots of interest and excitement about how to make agroforestry projects happen. Funding is a key question, and we've been working on one little bit of that, which is, can carbon finance, as it's done for other nature-based options like woodlands and some natural habitats, can it make a difference in terms of agroforestry? But just to be really clear, as again, if you didn't know before you came to the show, you'll now know that agroforestry is a very wide definition. So we've been focusing on infield trees. So those of you that have managed to do the farm walk here, and you've seen those trees in the alley systems, whether they're grazed or in a crop system, we've been looking at infield trees only. So the agroforestry systems like shelter belts, hedgerows, woodlands, they already have a potential home in other voluntary carbon standards, either the Woodland Carbon Code or the Developing Hedgerow Carbon Code. So we've just been focusing on that bit of agroforestry, and that's really important to emphasise that in terms of some of the sort of conclusions. So what have we been doing? Well, first of all, probably the key question for us has been, can we come up with a methodology to predict the carbon that is grown in those infield trees? They grow very differently to forest trees. Colin's going to tell you a lot more about that, because that's what Organic Research Centre have been thinking about. We've also then been thinking about what we're calling anyway, and I think increasingly are called sort of high integrity requirements. So if carbon is to help fund agroforestry projects, what are the sort of rules around that? So what are the sort of additionality tests? What are the permanence tests? What are all those sort of tricky things that don't just make it greenwashing, they actually mean that it makes a difference? So we've been thinking about that within the project. And then we've been using the sort of work from those two work streams to run 8 pilots. So 6 of them funded under this, maybe I didn't mention this at the start, but the funding has come from Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, which is a DEFRA fund. So they've funded the overall project and also 6 pilots in England. Scottish Forestry came on board and funded 2 pilots in Scotland. So in total, we've run 8 pilots, and all our conclusions come from that piloting. And you're going to hear a lot more about that from Helen. And then what we've done with that in the last few months, as we've been getting the conclusions from those pilots, we've been formulating our conclusions and our recommendations. And I'll sort of continue at the end after we've heard from Colin and Helen about those conclusions and, crucially, the next steps to maybe set up this question. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Colin, who's going to give you some technical information about how we've gone about understanding what carbon is actually in those trees.
Hi, so I'm Colin Tosh from the Organic Research Centre. I'm a senior agroforestry researcher. So yeah, Will Simonson, who's also in the audience, and I were brought into this, I guess because we have a reputation for being fairly quantitative and technically minded, so they asked us to come up with a technique, which wasn't easy. The Woodland Carbon Code, they've been working on it for 20 years, so they've had time to think and develop about this, but we were given a year to do this, so it was quite a challenging task. And so the first thing we said, well, can we just use the Woodland Carbon Code's calculator to calculate? Basically what we were doing is, if a farmer says, I'm going to plant 100 oaks, 200 ash in an agroforestry system, what we wanted to find out was how much carbon there will be in that system in 30 years. And the rate of carbon sequestration each year. That was the problem. So we could have just gone straight to the Woodland Carbon Calculator, but there's this issue of density. So forestry is usually defined as density of about 1,400 per hectare, and below that your agroforestry is usually considered below that. And the nature of trees in these different systems are completely different. I mean, I'll talk you through the data, but I mean, you know the difference in these Sitka spruce plantations where they're all squeezed together. The tree is a spindle with lots of tiny tiny branches, and then you've got a bit of canopy up top. Whereas if you put a tree in a more open agroforestry system, you get you get these 3 big branches coming off, and you get these giant branches. The trees are just completely different, and all these graphs are showing are really the top graph is stem volume, the bottom it's biggest branch diameter, and basically once you get below about 1,400 per hectare, the stem volume goes up considerably in trees, and the largest branch diameter goes up. So just like I say, you get these big branches. And I looked in another paper that continues the bottom graph along a bit, and this continues this biggest branch diameter. So as the trees get more and more spaced out, you get like smaller numbers of big branches. So we talked to the Woodland Carbon Code about this, and do you think it's realistic for us to use your Woodland Carbon Calculator given the trees that are so different in agroforestry and forestry systems? And they advise us, no, probably it isn't. You probably have to come up with your own methodology. And there's also the problem that the trees grown in agroforestry system, fruit and nuts, aren't represented within the Woodland Carbon Code. So we had the daunting task in a year of coming up with a new methodology to calculate carbon accumulation in agroforestry trees. There's your Woodland Carbon Calculator. So if you want to calculate how much carbon is accumulating in your woodlands, go there. And these are the 2 references that I've just used. So what we decided to go with was sort of a farmer measurement and allometric approach using allometric equations to calculate carbon accumulation. So we decided that farmers should go into the field if they want to calculate carbon accumulated. They need to go into the field and measure a number of the DBH, the diameter at breast height of a number of trees of the species they're looking at, preferably of a range of known ages. Yeah? So we are advising farmers to, if the oak, for example, you want oak from 1 to 50 years, as many specimens as you can. Measure the DBH and take a note of that. And do that for each of the species that you're intending to grow. This DBH age data, we've created a spreadsheet which will be available eventually. If not at the moment, this data can be entered into, and it then gets fitted to this formula in the spreadsheet, which was first developed by McPherson and Simpson quite a few years ago. It's basically an S-shaped equation. It doesn't look S-shaped in there, but for different data sets, it's like an S on its side. So the spreadsheet then fits it to that data, the DBH age data. We plug the DBH into the Bunce equation. So the Bunce equation is an equation that converts DBH, or actually tree girth, circumference, to above ground dry weight. It's a very famous equation, which I think the Woodland Calculator also uses in parts. Some people think it's been overextended, but we didn't see many other alternatives. So we convert all the DBH values in this blue line in the graph to above ground dry weight using the Bunce equation. We then add below ground dry weight using IPCC data. For broadleaf trees, we've chosen a mean value of 0.326. It varies a little bit, but not that much. So we add that onto the above ground dry weight. We convert to carbon. So carbon to above ground dry weight is a ratio of 0.448. So if you dry the wood, dry the biomass of a tree, the amount of carbon in that is about half of it. And then we multiply that for the number of trees in the agroforestry system for each species you're intending to grow. And then we take away various setup and maintenance emissions. So stuff like the amount of emissions associated with plastic tree guards, the amount of diesel you use to plant trees, maintain trees and stuff like that. And this is all in a spreadsheet. and it gets basically the total amount of carbon sequestered at 30 years, and you divide that by 30 to get the amount of carbon sequestered every year. So these are the findings. Helen will talk a bit more about the pilots, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 8. Was it 8 pilots right across the country? These are typically fairly small agroforestry setups. Agroforestry is fairly small in tow and water at the moment in the UK. So we asked farmers, and we did some of the tree measurements ourselves. We went out and did it to do the tree measurements in the agroforestry systems they're growing, the species they're growing. We applied the calculator and to each of these 8 sites. And what we found was that net sequestration over 30 years, so tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare per year, varied from about 10 to less than 1. I'll talk about means and stuff in a moment. So you're getting, I can't remember what the mean was. What was the mean? Just over 2 tons of carbon per hectare per year. These sites were predominantly silvopastoral. There were a couple of silvo-arable sites and some mixed. So if you compare these now, this is net sequestration just per year over the whole site, and compare that to the amount of carbon sequestered from hedgerows and trees, you can see that the amount of carbon sequestered from hedgerows and trees is really swamping the amount of carbon sequestered from agroforestry by a factor, typically a 10-fold factor or something like that. So carbon sequestered from agroforestry is relatively minor to these 2 others.
That's 30 years?
Yeah, well, that's per year. Per year, over 30 years.
Beyond 30 years?
That's right. So this is us imagining a new system being planted and how much it sequesters over the next 30 years per year. Because this is in the carbon code. This is how landowners are going to be coming to us. Yeah, they're going to be about to plant a new system, and they want to know how much carbon's going to accumulate there. Okay. So we wondered if this is actually, we got these figures, are they correct? So we went to a recent international review by it's in the bottom, the Cardinal. They looked at 10 silvopastoral systems in temperate regions and looked at rates of carbon sequestration. If I remember rightly, I think their tree density, it was about 800. So anyway, they found that for 10 systems where the tree density was about 800 trees per hectare, that it's about 11 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. And we found that our data and our pilots' rate of sequestration was about a third of that, our data there. So that worried us, but when we thought a little bit why this is, we thought about density, and we also find that the density of the trees that are grown internationally tends to be much higher. It's around about 800 trees per hectare, and in our system, the mean was about 200 trees per hectare. So in the UK, people are growing agroforestry systems at a much lower density. So we corrected for that density, and fairly sweetly, we find that when we correct for density, the carbon sequestration rates that we calculated here are pretty much exactly the same as those for international silvopastoral, temperate silvopastoral that have been reviewed. And people sometimes ask me, could you give me a benchmark figure for carbon sequestration rates? Well, I think this is probably about as close as you'll get to it. For temperate silvopastoral, for about 800 trees per hectare, you're looking at just over 10 tons of CO2 equivalents per hectare per year. And below that, you can just divide by the density, and that should give you a figure. we wanted to. We also wanted to know if we were justified in not using the Woodland Carbon calculator to do this. So we ran the Woodland Carbon calculator on our pilot sites, corrected it for density just like we did for us, and we found, as we thought we would, that it doesn't perform especially well. It doesn't perform as well as our calculator. Well, like I say, the Woodland Carbon calculator was developed for trees that are tall and spindly and dense stands, so it's quite conservative. The amount of carbon, the rate of carbon accumulation is lower than it would be in an agroforestry system. When we've done online seminars asking farmers if they'd be prepared to go out and measure trees like this, we found about half of farmers would be prepared to do this. We thought it was necessary in this project to get findings, but we have a hunch maybe it might hold the thing back if farmers have to go out and actually measure tree girths before to measure carbon accumulation rates. So I think what we probably need to do is automate this system at some point, and the way we're planning to do it is to use predictive modelling. So we've already accumulated quite a lot of data in this project, but we'll go to the literature, and what you do is using statistical techniques like GLM, if you link published carbon sequestration rates, and then you have these things that might vary with that, like tree species, latitude, longitude, annual mean temp, windfall, blah, blah, blah. You can plug that into a statistical model, and it'll tell you which of those covariates correlate very closely with carbon accumulation rate, and it'll tell you which ones don't, which ones you can scrub off. So we should be able to get to a stage where we can predict, using a formula, we can predict carbon accumulation rate based on a few things like where the tree occurs on Earth, what the soil type is, and so on and so forth. So we plan to come up with a predictive model that will allow farmers to automatically predict what their carbon accumulation rate for the most common agroforestry trees will be. And that's really my part. That was highly technical. Sorry, but hopefully the next bits won't be quite so much.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, I mean, thank you, Colin. Yeah, it is technical, this, and we were sort of a bit concerned about presenting too much technical information, but I think one of the key sort of points we want to get across to you is that a lot of the carbon measurement that's done currently in trees in the UK, i.e. trees in woodland, has had sort of 100 years worth of research and development to get us to that place in terms of really accurate woodland carbon code lookup tables. We've had a relatively short project, not very much funding, to try and address this question that hasn't had much research in the last 100 years, which is how trees grow outside of woodlands. So it's really important to understand that. There's a couple of sort of, maybe that's one of the facts that you can take away. And then this number that Colin did give us, which is about 2 tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year, based on the pilots that we run, which we're now going to hear a lot more about from Helen.
Hi, yes, I'm Helen Cheshire, and you won't get any technical details from me, so I'm certainly not a technical expert in this. And yeah, I'm representing the Woodland Trust, and I was involved in the project, but my colleague Ilona really did lead much more of this, along with John Haynes from the Soil Association. John's busy doing one of the farm walks, being a Pied Piper with about 200 people following him, and Ilona is on taking much deserved leave, so I'm a bit of a stand-in, I'm afraid. But yeah, so I'm just going to tell you basically a bit more, bring the pilots alive a bit really. So as Clive said, we had 6 pilots funded in England by the NEIRF project, and 2, which was great to have on board in Scotland, funded by Scottish Forestry. We wanted to get a really diverse mixture of types of agroforestry, which we did. So we had sort of typical silver arable in Essex and in Nottinghamshire, and then we had more silver pastoral down in the southwest, and also another project up in Yorkshire. And then in Scotland we had quite a well-established silver pastoral system, as well as an established silver arable scheme. So we had a real nice mixture of agroforestry projects and a diversity of locations. So we had to collect quite a lot of data when we went out to have these with these farmers. So the farmers were generous with their time, both in advance of the visit that we made to them and while we were actually visiting with them. So we collected a range of information. We had a farm carbon questionnaire, which consisted of 20 questions, which was really to try and understand the farmer's current knowledge and preferences of how an agroforestry code and market might operate. So we then had a financial appraisal form, which was really to collect the data for Finance Earth to do all the clever number crunching. So that we needed to understand the costs of the establishment for the agroforestry, the costs of maintenance, any grant support they'd received, any income that they were going to potentially get from the products. So we really, there was a lot of information, which not all the farmers, it's not necessarily that easy to get to hand. We also needed the data that Colin and Will needed to do their clever stuff with the model, so the data on the actual agroforestry system. So as Colin said, we needed those previous land use, what it had been, the land had been before it was turned into agroforestry, or was going to be turned into agroforestry, planting dates, the establishment, maintenance and harvesting operations, and basically we needed to understand what that the carbon measurements, so understanding of emissions so that we could actually complete that carbon measurement. So it included the machinery types, the soil types, the types of tree protection. We then did we had to collect with the way that we'd selected to do the actual carbon measurement, so the diameter at breast height. So quite challenging. We needed to measure the actual trees because these were all actually had planted their trees, but getting those different age ranges, which wasn't necessarily that straightforward. So we gave ourselves a maximum distance of 5 kilometres, and I think, Colin, you did spend some time going to stately homes and community orchards.
RHS gardens and that sort of thing.
To try and get that accurate data of different ages of the same species that were in the agroforestry system. And then we also measured the other woody features on the farm, so the hedges, the shelter belts, the small farm woodlands. So I'm just going to give you 2 examples of the 2 of the pilots that we did, one in England and one in Scotland. So this one is located in Essex. It's a large farm, 860 hectares, and the type of agroforestry that is just starting to being developed is a single tree line system. With uncropped alleys. So the real aim of this farmer is to develop a productive nut system. So it's walnuts and hazelnuts, and then have timber production through oak. He also has a separate cricketback willow project, which was also included in the measurements. And then in the alleys, rather than doing a sort of cereal production, it was to do an uncropped alleys with agri-environment scheme. So looking at the environmental benefits between the alleys. So the proportions were 16% walnut, 14% hazel, and 58% oak. And then the cricketback willow, which is kind of in a separate project area, is 12% of the land. So for last season, he planted 1,900 trees across 60 hectares, and the aim is to plant a further 4,000 walnuts and hazelnuts this season across 104 hectares. And the cricketback willow, which is the picture in the screen, covers an area of 9 hectares. And I think from the data he gave, the approximate cost or the average cost of setting up those trees was £30 a tree. So when we did the farmer appraisal on his impressions of the carbon market, these were some of the key points that he made. So, as I say, driven very much by setting up a commercial nut system. So really the carbon was seen as a bit of a bonus because biodiversity is also a very important driver for this particular farmer. So assuming the nut productive system is successful, then the project would be as permanent as those nut trees were productive, and they would be replaced through a rotational process. So he felt only he could guarantee the carbon in the system for the shortest rotation length, which would have been the hazels, 25 years. So again, it's that the commercial viability of the tree products was really the key driver. So that was the main things from that, really. In terms of the barriers to actually selling the carbon, he didn't think self-monitoring was an issue. He would probably do it anyway. As I say, carbon is not the priority. And verification fees, only willing to pay if it was worthwhile, he was going to make a small profit from the actual sale of the carbon units. Fairly pragmatic approach. He'd be willing to talk to any interested buyers, but again, the price, he felt it was more of a bigger story. It would be the story of the whole project that would be really part of the selling of that carbon. So these are the results. So that was based on the work that Colin and Will did at ORC. So the total carbon sequestration that was estimated from the model for the timber and nuts system was just over 60 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. But if you then took in the additional elements on the farm, which consisted of both established and new hedgerows of just under 60 kilometres and established woodland at 97 hectares, you got a total figure of nearly 439 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. So moving on to Scotland. This is a beautiful farm because I have been lucky enough to go and see it just south of Fife, looking over the water of the Forth. And this is a silver arable scheme influenced by Stephen Briggs, so it's apple trees. It's a lovely story because they've planted 38 different varieties of cider apple and are now marketing it. It's planted in 2016 and actually it was funded through the Woodland Trust Trees for Your Farm scheme, so that's why I'm so familiar with it. So you've got the apple is making up 40% and the native broadleaf woodland 60%. That is done in a separate part of the farm as sort of woodland shelter belts. He's planted 10 hectares of mixed broadleafs over the last 4 years, of which 5 hectares were done last year. But it is a beautiful farm if you're ever in the area, and he's now marketing the cider. So his views on carbon, he just hadn't really considered it. You know, he was setting up a silver arable scheme because of the opportunities to diversify into the cider market, but also very much from the environmental benefits that would bring to his cereal production as well. But he was willing to commit to 40 years, the full productive lifespan of his apple trees, very willing to consider the insurance and covenants to be able to sell the carbon, and very happy to self-monitor. A bit like the previous pilot, yes, willing to be part of verification, but reluctant to pay unless there was a clear profit up from the carbon. He had quite strong views on who he would be interested in selling his carbon to. Price is important, but the company had to be the right company, not interested in selling to oil companies or fertilizer companies. Really wanted to portray that story of what he was doing on his farm in the total picture. And that's just a graph of lots of measurements, which, yeah, I'm not going to start to explain, but obviously the key shows different species of, as I say, he had 38 different varieties, and that's the different DBH measurements. So these are the results from this pilot. So as I say, I think sometimes you have to sort of visualize this. You know, this is quite a large silver arable in the sense it's over 6.5 hectares, but it's only just over 700 apple trees. So when you have to kind of think about that, I think, or I do, to think, so why does it sound like it's a really small amount of carbon? Well, actually, it's not many trees, and these are small apple trees. So the total model estimated figure of the net carbon sequestration figure was of 0.5 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year for the silver arable. If you then added in his beech and mixed woodlands, which cover an area of 10 hectares, then the total tonnage is nearly 93 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year. And so this is just a slide which just summarises when we looked at all of the farmer questionnaires and their attitudes to carbon. So it really wasn't seen as a priority to the farmers, but I suppose you have to caveat that these farmers are already doing their agroforestry. They'd already started when an agroforestry carbon code wasn't even being talked about. But they were interested in selling the units as long as they could cover their verification costs and they made a small profit out of it. The commitment would generally be dictated by the tree species, so obviously that could range from as little as 25 years to probably 50 years, because a lot of these were productive fruit and nut trees. They would be willing to commit to a contract and the verifications, and self-monitoring was all acceptable as long as it was financially workable and worthwhile. And the general consensus from the overall of the 8 pilots was that ethical buyers were preferable. These were farmers who were gone into agroforestry for the environmental, social aspects. So, it's not really surprising. And it's that story. It was part of a bigger picture of how they were trying to market their farm. So that's me.
Thanks, Helen. Thanks, Helen. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy organising life to present those slides. Hopefully, by taking you through a little bit of detail about two of the pilots, as well as talking to you about the subject of this session, that's just two more examples of agroforestry that you can take away from the show, because two quite inspiring farmers there that are taking big projects forward that kindly allowed us to use their sites as pilots. Okay, well, as I said earlier, we're not able to be joined by anybody from Finance Earth, but so I'm going to do my best to present these slides about this. Coming back to the question that I posed, that we posed at the start of the project, which is what is the ability of the carbon to provide additional finance to support additional agroforestry implementation? These pilot sites, they've already made that decision, but would carbon finance help more agroforestry projects to get off the ground? It's really important to do this sort of financial appraisal. So these are the sort of key questions that Finance Earth were focused on. So, what role can that carbon income play to support agroforestry projects? What blend? So there's other sources of potential funding. So how might any carbon money be blended with grant money, or crucially, the agroforestry product revenues that many of these systems are sort of being driven by, because you have to take that into account in the overall sort of cash flow when you think about integrity requirements like additionality. So they were looking at that. And then I guess sort of bigger picture, coming to the project conclusions that we'll present shortly, is there basically a commercial case for an agroforestry carbon code as a standalone code? So they were helping us with that. And then they were also thinking about the sort of the buyer side of this. Is there anything different about a ton of CO2 from an agroforestry project compared to other projects in terms of potential demand? So they were the sort of questions. As you've already heard from Colin, so a lot of this is driven. So the conclusions on these next two slides are driven by the carbon, and they're driven by the overall project costs. Okay, so when Finance Earth analysed the potential contribution from carbon for the 5 pilots that are on the screen here, it ranged between as little as 0.4% of the overall project costs to the biggest figure, 4%. So, i.e., not very much. And that's because agroforestry projects can be quite expensive to put in place. They usually have much higher maintenance costs over their project life. And as you've already concluded, hopefully, the amount of carbon that's sequestered in relatively low density typical projects in the UK at the moment is modest amounts. I think the mean total was 2 tonnes CO2 equivalent per year per hectare. So not very much to sort of drive it all. So that's a key conclusion. And then this just is another way of sort of presenting that, really, because although it's only a small amount, depending on how some sort of standard or scheme was designed, it could still be quite an important contribution. So the light blue bar in year 0 is the potential carbon finance that could help to offset some of the orange bar and the green bars below the line, so in terms of the negative numbers in those first 4 to 5 years where you've got all the capital costs. Now remember, and again this has been the subject of separate sessions at this show, at the moment, certainly in England and Wales, there's been some recent announcements in Scotland, there are no specific in-field agroforestry grants. So we've made a few assumptions in this, but we haven't been able to factor in any specific grants into the project work that we've done here. But I think that graph illustrates the point, really, that most of there's a long sort of period of maintenance costs, but hopefully in an agroforestry project there's also a long period of revenue in terms of the positive impact. So going back to the sort of key finance questions that they were helping us with, these are the key conclusions that they drew in their separate report, which is an annex to the main report. So as I've already said, the primary driver of any agroforestry project is, and I think we're supportive of this from a policy point of view, it kind of makes absolute sense that it should be based on the agroforestry product revenues and also the wider benefits to the farming system of implementing those trees. So, you know, that's one of their key conclusions. But importantly, carbon income could play a role in supporting initial capital expenditure and provide an additional diversified income source if we perhaps think about the design, and that's where I'm going to take you in terms of the conclusions. So they were thinking about whether an agroforestry carbon code is viable as a standalone, and they're, you know, unlikely. To make a standalone scheme work, you've got to have sufficient uptake and kind of revenue in the system to fund the thing. So that was their conclusion. In terms of the demand for carbon credits, I mean, their perspective at the moment is that demand exceeds supply. So it's quite difficult to sort of differentiate whether or not a ton of CO2 from an agroforestry project would have a differentiation in the market because of that kind of overall market situation. As I say, that report's been put together by Alicia Gibson, who has led on this from Finance Earth. So hopefully I've done my best to present that information. Okay, final couple of slides before we open this up. I mentioned these high integrity requirements at the start, and those of you that know a little bit about the Woodland Carbon Code, or even just a little bit about woodlands and how they kind of operate in the UK and in a sort of regulatory sense, it's a different system to an agroforestry system. Agroforestry is really a farming system with trees, whereas the Woodland Carbon Code is based on a forestry system which is regulated through the sort of the forestry regulations in the UK. So we had to think about some of those things in terms of these kind of high integrity requirements. I'm not going to take you through the detail on this slide, but what we did, the way we approached this was to use the Woodland Carbon Code as it is at the moment and say, are the current requirements for things like eligibility, scope, monitoring, reporting and verification, and a whole heap of other requirements, are they fit for purpose for agroforestry projects? And our sort of broad conclusion was that they were for about 90% of the requirements in the Woodland Carbon Code. There were a couple of areas where they weren't fit for purpose based on where agroforestry is currently in the UK and also based on that regulatory framework. So the first one is additionality. So within the Woodland Carbon Code, forestry activity, despite us only being at 13% woodland cover in the UK, it's common. It's reasonably common. There's quite a lot of woodlands being planted. There's quite a lot of woodlands being managed. So it's very appropriate for the Woodland Carbon Code to have a sort of financial additionality test. So, i.e., does the carbon make a difference in terms of that woodland project going forward? What we're proposing, and these are our proposals, is for additionality for agroforestry at the moment, is it should just be a simpler approach. Shouldn't be a financial test in the early years. It should just be based on a legal test, which is a kind of standard thing anyway, and what's called a common practice test. So it isn't currently common practice. It automatically passes that test in terms of additionality. And we've done some work on what a financial test might look like in the future, but we don't think we're at that point yet. The other key one is around the sort of issue of permanence. So in the UK, woodland is regulated to mean that once you've made a decision to plant a new woodland, it's pretty much a permanent change in land use. It's actually one of the barriers to woodland creation in different contexts. But in terms of the Woodland Carbon Code, it underpins that high integrity requirement. You can say that that woodland's going to be there indefinitely into the future. Well, agroforestry is not like that. It's part of a rotation potentially. It's part of a farming system. So our proposals on that, we've basically come up with two different options. One would be effectively a temporary crediting period. So for shorter term projects that didn't want to commit to a longer term, then they may be able to develop a temporary credit for a 30-year period. There may be a market for those, remembering net zero, the kind of goal is 2050, so that 30-year period. Or we could just mimic what the Woodland Carbon Code does and say, if it's part of a rotation, the carbon number that comes from that agroforestry system takes into account the fact that it's going to be replaced every 30 years during the project lifetime, which for the Woodland Carbon Code is 100 years. So it's a bit like a clear fell. You're removing all the trees, you're replanting some trees, but you're allowed to sell far less carbon as a result of managing it in that way. So they're the sort of two broad options that we've included in the report. Okay, so conclusions. I think you probably know where some of this has gone really in terms of how we've presented this information. But from a project perspective, we were set up to investigate the feasibility for an agroforestry carbon code. And our sort of clear conclusion is that not only is it not a sensible thing to do, it's not viable. To just do it for infill trees is not a viable business model to develop a separate scheme and a standard and all the paraphernalia that goes with running that. But we also don't think it's sensible from a policy perspective because those trees in those infield agroforestry systems, they don't exist in isolation of what else is going on that farm or on that project. And that's why we looked at the hedgerows, we looked at the woodlands. And when you start to think about this as different carbon pools, either at a whole farm level or maybe a landscape level, in terms of the different woody biomass systems and maybe even some other carbon pools in future around soil, it makes far more sense to think about this in an aggregated way. But currently the sort of voluntary carbon market has very much gone down a bit of a silo approach to this. And really our sort of key conclusion is that we need to think about this in a much more aggregated way. So the work that we've done could be picked up and could find its way, and I'll come to the very last slide on that in a moment as to one of the homes it might find its way to. But it really needs to be thought about at that sort of whole farm level or that whole project level. The third conclusion on the screen there, and you'll have got this sense from Colin's presentation, and I sort of made that point after he finished speaking, that the Woodland Carbon Code has benefited from the 100 years of research and innovation that's gone on to develop yield class models for forest systems. We just don't have that in the UK at the moment. There are some other projects going on, and I can see one or two people in the room who are involved in some of those projects. We would very much like this work to be, it's all going to be open source, picked up and taken forward by better funded organisations and projects into the future, because it needs a lot more work to make it a really user-friendly, predictive model like you've got with the Woodland Carbon Code lookup tables. Okay, so what are our next steps? From a practical project point of view, the project closed on the 31st of August. That was our deadline for completing our project outputs to DEFRA. The reports, there were 3 separate reports, one on the pilots, one on the financial appraisal, then an overall report that pulled everything together. They were sent off to NEIRF on Friday. So from that sort of purely pragmatic point of view, our job is done. But we've all got a lot of interest in where this all ends up. So we've concluded that there's not a case for a standalone agroforestry carbon code. So what would we like to see happen? Well, provocatively on the screen here, and I don't feel too bad showing it in this week in this tent, because I presented this very same slide to the Woodland Carbon Code Executive Board last Thursday, where I'd done a bit of track changes to their document to maybe think about rescoping the Woodland Carbon Code so that in future, and obviously our focus has been agroforestry, but it could be broader than that. It could be trees outside of woodlands. And crucially, I think that needs to be thought about. And we had a very receptive hearing from the Woodland Carbon Code. They didn't give us a yes, but they were never going to give us a yes. But they're definitely going to go away and think about it. And I'm going to invite Andy in a moment to give us a response on that. Don't worry, he knows I'm going to ask him to give a response on that. The second sort of next step, we've already made it clear to NEIRF that we want to make all of the work that we've done open source. So the work that's been done on the modelling, the conclusions from the pilots, the financial appraisal. There's no aspiration within this project team to make this black box and kind of develop a sort of commercial business model ourselves. We think this needs to be picked up and integrated into other opportunities. Obviously, the Woodland Carbon Code is one, but there are other shows in town. There are other standards and schemes where agroforestry potentially is potentially in scope, and who knows what might emerge in this sort of wider whole farm thinking sort of area, and we have had some reasonably good news in recent days about some additional development money that we've had to pursue that aggregated whole farm idea in Scotland. So yeah, that's I think I've covered the 3 points on that slide. So yeah, over to that's everything we've got to say. I'm gonna start the Q&A by well, first of all, if you can start to put your hands up, but I'm going to give Andy sort of first response in terms of the question I've already asked him.
So yeah, thanks, Clive. So just as one thing to say as well, just where we draw the line for the Woodland Carbon Code, as in what is a woodland. For us, it's 400 stems per hectare, and it has to have the capacity to reach at least 20% canopy cover. So that's based on the National Forest Inventory, and as Clive was saying about a lot of the regulation around forestry and felling licence applications, that sort of thing, we're quite protected on that permanence front because of that. So that's where we draw the line. Anything less dense than that, and we're terrified. So this is where Clive's work is really useful. So that was just a start on that. And then in terms of the executive board last week and the response, overwhelmingly positive. It was something that we were saying, yes, absolutely, this is something that we definitely want to explore further. As Clive says, there are certain technical hurdles to overcome, permanence, additionality, that sort of thing. And these need to be explored really thoroughly and make sure that we're matching up with all the international guidance that's coming out in the future over the next few months. There's a lot of talk about what is permanent, what is additional, how you should approach all these different things. But the more, as Clive says, the demand is massively outstripping the supply at the moment for carbon credits. So the more carbon we can get into that system, the better. And also there are a lot of farmers that are looking at some woodland creation, a bit of agroforestry, and can we amalgamate that together? At the minute, we can't do that with the Woodland Carbon Code. As I say, that's our little box, that's what we stay in. But if we were to allow for a more wide farm level verification, you could start looking at soil carbon, hedgerow carbon, agroforestry, woodland planting, all of that being brought in together. Well, that might start actually making economic sense from a verification perspective and that sort of thing. And with all of this is based on economics in many ways, and a massive thing is the price of carbon is expected to continue going up very rapidly. There are some reports from the government saying it should be worth £300 per tonne by 2030. Well, if you're looking at 60 tonnes per hectare over a 30-year period from an agroforestry scheme, yeah, okay, at £10, £20 per tonne at the minute, that might not make sense. 300, people might be mad not to do it. So there are all these things that come into it. But essentially, yeah, the Woodland Carbon Code are definitely keen. It just is definitely needed further work.
Hello, I'm Alex Adam from the Rivers Trust. Thank you very much. Curious to understand what the carbon figure was used for the Finance Earth baselining. What was their tonne per carbon, price per tonne?
It's a good question because it's all fundamentally about that. So I think that was based on what our current additionality cash flow uses, our published data from the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. So it's looking at about £15 per tonne for PIUs, but then £21 per tonne for the Woodland Carbon Guarantee. But this is something that will be able to become more accurate as we move forwards, because the Woodland Carbon Code over the last year have done a piece of research through Ecosystem Marketplace, talking to all of the main players in the Woodland Carbon Code at the minute, more than 70-80% of all carbon units sold, asking them for their price data for breakdowns of different types of woodland over time, that sort of thing. And so again, a far more accurate idea of how much this carbon is actually worth. And so that will be able to be fed in as time goes on as well. But yeah, I think it was around £20 per tonne.
And when are you publishing that price data, Andy?
That was a sneaky one, Andy. Yeah.
Hi, Alexa Vara from I'm in Academia. A question for Colin Tosh. Colin, I know you had a really hard job. It's really difficult to estimate the volume of open-grown trees. Can you say something about whether you think any of your estimations are underestimates or whether they might be overestimates? Do you have any idea of how these would compare if you were able to destructively sample the trees? And the equations you used, did they come from destructive sampling?
The Bunce equation, I believe, originally it came from destructive sampling. That's when they get a digger and dig up a tree, and then the roots and all, and they dry the thing and weigh it. A big. So you get the ultimate measure of how much carbon is there. So the Bunce equation was originally developed by Bob Bunce, who was in Natural England. I think he died about 6 months ago. And they did that for a number of broadleaf species, and there seems to be this correlation between DBH, the diameter of the trunk, and the amount of carbon in or biomass in the tree, and it seems to be a reasonably stable and reliable relationship. There's this issue of, I guess, if people are pruning trees every year, you know what I mean? That could, I'm not sure that's taken into account, so that our method could potentially, I guess, underestimate in that respect. But it was fairly reassuring that our techniques, when corrected for density, seem to correlate so closely with a range of international studies that have used a range of different techniques to measure carbon. So I think we were surprised by that, that it was so spot on. But we have a reasonable amount of confidence in it for that reason, I think.
Thanks, Colin. Yeah, perhaps understandably, the pilots that we worked with weren't up for any destructive sampling. So.
James Hebben-Scott from Forest Carbon, thank you all for your presentations. Really fascinating and very exciting. There's 100 questions I'd like to ask, but I'm actually going to just ask one to Andy, if I may. I'm sort of semi-retired now, and I may have been sleeping when this report from the government came out last week about this £300 a tonne. I need you to give me the reference to that report, Andy, because that is a really, really astonishing piece of news. And I would only just say, lest we all get too excited about that, that only happens if a lot of people are prepared to pay their hard-earned money, for that carbon. And if they were to get anywhere near it, from 25 today to £300 in 2030, which is actually quite hard to imagine if you understand the market we're in, they're going to require very, very highly validated and verified and really high quality carbon with huge assurances. And in the same time, the international market, you can get pretty good verified carbon credits, solid carbon from Latin America for, in the high teens at the moment. And I think that's still going to be there. So, people who are trying to sell this carbon are going to have to work out how to get the price to that. It doesn't just happen.
No, it's a really good question, James. So I don't have the link on me at the minute, but I will get back to you after the show. It was actually a report from about a year ago. It was a government report about a year ago talking about the expected projection of where carbon prices are going to go. So I'll share that with you after the show for sure.
But I think just a general observation on James's point. A lot of this is uncertain, isn't it? We're operating in a very uncertain, embryonic sort of market. I think that's why when we drew the conclusions from the project, we took a lot of confidence from the fact that there's quite a strong business case for doing this anyway. And it's whether or not the carbon finance, when it's aggregated with the other carbon pools at a project level, starts to make more sense for small and medium-sized farms and projects.
Thanks, that was really interesting. Millie from the University of Reading. I was wondering if any of you could provide some context for how this works internationally. Are there other countries which have agroforestry carbon codes and are paying farmers for this already? And if so, how do they do it there?
That's the big question. It was covered as part of the project. So some of the work that Mark Reed did for us in the sort of early months of the project was to do that sort of international view. I'm quoting from memory now. There were two main kind of carbon approaches that potentially covered agroforestry. One called Acorn, an Acorn framework, which is specifically to agroforestry. But then I think some of the Vera standards, Andy might be able to help me out on this one, some of the Vera standards potentially can cover agroforestry internationally.
Yeah, I think so. They've got over 40 different methodologies in agriculture and forestry, so I'm sure some of them can include agroforestry systems.
Yeah, but I'd be happy to talk about that a bit more afterwards, because it's quite a deep question, that, in terms of what's going on internationally. We weren't funded to really look at that in any detail. So.
Hi, fascinating presentation. Thanks very much. I'm Kate. I'm a smallholder from Worcestershire. I was sort of having a thought process going on, and rather than going away and doing a lot of Googling, there's a lot of experts in the room, so I just thought I'd put it out there. So your farmers were interested in selling the whole story of what was going on their farm. They were also concerned about ethical buyers. We know historically from the post-war years that where farmers have got to is a place of powerlessness based on not being able to control the cost of their inputs or the price they get on their outputs. And I wonder if we're sleepwalking in this new environment into a situation where we're not going to be in control of how to market and value the carbon that we're sequestrating on our farms. And so I start thinking, I have a business career and a small holding. I know from my experience in selling that selling to people that you trust, and they trust you is a good way to sell. And I'm wondering if there are any legal or economic barriers to me forming partnerships with commercial organisations who want to buy carbon credits, and if so, what those might be and how they might be overcome.
Another huge question. I'm going to speak from a little bit of wider experience on that one. So what's going on, I think, in the sort of voluntary carbon markets generally, in terms of the sort of development of these high integrity requirements, is starting to focus a lot more on what you would call the demand side as well as the production side. So a lot of the standards and schemes initially have focused on making sure that the trees are going to be there long term, that the carbon finance genuinely does make a difference to that project. But as you heard from Helen, at least one of the pilots, I think a few of the pilots, they're also concerned about who might buy their carbon. So I think that's where the sort of whole, and remember, this is a voluntary world. This kind of operates voluntary. There is some sort of more of a framework coming in from some of the sort of government activity. But I think those kind of voluntary standard and schemes are starting to move much more towards being very specific about who can buy the carbon through those schemes. So that's giving more control. I think a lot of your other wider points could apply to many different topics, actually. They're not just specific to carbon. It's about food production generally, timber production generally. Do you have a sort of
Well, so I understand the food production regulations and who I can sell to and why. What I'm unclear about is whether there are any regulatory reasons why I can't write a contract between me and a company that wants to buy carbon credits directly without going through one of the markets.
No, there's nothing. You don't have to use these schemes. They're optional, and people are doing that. What you've just described. Yeah. What we're talking about here is the schemes and where the work we've done might end up in a sort of a voluntary scheme rather than something completely unregulated.
And even if you do use these schemes, you can still sell it to whoever you want.
Right.
Hi, I'm Niels Caulfield, independent advisor. So I just wanted to get a bit of clarification on the sort of carbon values you quoted, so that 2 tonnes per hectare per year. Does that also include soil carbon? Is that kind of like a gross figure that's including all carbon pools, basically?
The only case where we looked at soil carbon was when land had been converted from arable to agroforestry, and then we looked at the area under the trees and applied the Woodland Carbon Code calculator. But otherwise, we assumed that the carbon dynamics of the field around about the agroforestry was relatively unchanged there. So it doesn't heavily involve soil carbon, no.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the main reason I'm sort of pointing to that is that there is evidence from conversion from pasture where we're seeing a decline in soil carbon. So I guess, again, sort of the sleepwalking thing, will that be built into the sort of the carbon code that all pools have to be basically?
My reading of the evidence is that conversion from pasture to agroforestry doesn't make that much difference to soil carbon. That's my reading of the literature.
Can I comment on this?
Yeah, thank you. Well, just to say, yeah, you were very right that, yeah, there's evidence that conversion could decline carbon in the soil. And just to say that we are, I don't know whether you, Andy, knows about DEFRA project, which launched about a year ago, and we are doing soil carbon evaluation on the 150 woodland carbon code sites, and with the aim to look at all this conversion from arable to farm woodland, from pasture, from grassland, from managed land, so any single kind of conversion, you know, we could pick up as a difference, and also to evaluate the different tree species impact, mixture impact, also fenced and unfenced areas on soil carbon. So we've already sampled 60 sites last year, and this year is going to be about another 150 sites. So next year's evaluation results, and the aim is really to try and get that data together to start looking at lookup tables for soils under the Woodland Carbon Code. And just one more point, we got another agroforestry project kicked off last year, and it would be really great if we can maybe use some of your pilot trials to look at soil carbon on a different systems. And we are going to choose another 10 to 15 pilot projects where we're going to evaluate above and below ground carbon and nutrient balances. And we could test the relationships you've developed, and we could add some more knowledge on soil carbon rates of change based on the woodland age, tree types, mixtures,
Yeah, I mean,
and spacing, which is very important, as you mentioned.
It was just like in 2022, in August, we looked at the literature, and at that time we decided there's no, apart from one or two scenarios, there's no strong relationship between land transformation and carbon dynamics. But as it's studied, these will occur, and we can update this. Yeah.
We got some evidence about shelter belts I presented yesterday, which increased 30 tons. For 10 years, we have 30 tons additional carbon in the soil compared to open land near the shelter belt, housing the poultry. So it could be a very good news, especially depending on what soil type and land you are.
You didn't introduce yourself, but you're Elena from Forest Research. That's what I was hoping would happen, because what we've tried to convey here is that kind of the work we've done, that we've been funded to do, needs to go somewhere. We haven't got a budget to continue this, and much of what we've done we've kind of pegged to the Woodland Carbon Code. So whether it's the requirements or whether it's the assumption on soil carbon, if you're looking to develop those for the Woodland Carbon Code anyway, clearly they can be updated for this work as well. So, right, I'm going to rely on Paul and Andy, because it's the people who had their hands up when I last asked. So these three people here, yeah.
Hello, Scott Brown from the Cotswolds National Landscape. I'm just curious as to what extent the project looked at the differences between insetting versus offsetting approaches and carbon certificates versus carbon credits, and whether from the farmer's point of view, one approach may be preferable over the other, or indeed from a point of view of generating that initial investment, one approach may seem to be better suited to this than the other.
Well, yeah, obviously, the only comment I would make really is that, farmers need to think about their own insetting first. They need to get their own farm in order and think about their current supply chains and potential future supply chains. And I think that's the message that's starting to come out in the farming press, that, you need to, don't take unnecessary risks at this stage and sell your carbon before you really understand what your own business's inputs and outputs are, and make sure you get your own house in order is all I'm really going to say. And I think the pilots were definitely thinking that way. They hadn't set off to think about the carbon.
But I think the only other point to add is that the work that we did, so when you think about high integrity requirements, or you think about how you're going to measure this carbon, it applies equally to the offset or the inset market. We didn't specifically focus on that as a sort of question, because what we were really trying to do was put a framework in place for either option, really. So, okay, the two other questions at the front here. Yeah, two.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Catherine Laidlaw. I'm a landscape officer at Warwickshire County Council, part of a new natural capital team there. And we also we're part of a NEIRF project to look at developing Warwickshire carbon markets. And so I've got more of a comment really to the earlier questions about cost of carbon. So as part of our NEIRF report, we came out with a figure of about £220 a tonne, £220 per unit to realistically cover the cost of managing woodland for 100 years. And I think it might have been the government's Green Book where that £300 figure maybe was published, from what I recall. But in terms of finding markets for it, so what's happening in Warwickshire, one of our districts is developing it will come into effect next year, a sort of supplementary planning policy that will require new development to be net zero, so in the same way, sort of similar setup to BNG. But the sort of challenge, since I've only been in post for about 9 months and sort of been tasked with woodland creation and tree planting, is Warwickshire. This is kind of quite county specific, but it's finding locations for woodland is quite a challenge. And so I was quite excited with the sort of potential development of an agroforestry carbon code, because that's would kind of work quite well on our sort of county small holdings, for instance, and a lot more adaptable. So I was just wondering, I know you only had a meeting like last week, but is there kind of any sort of time scale of like how you might sort of integrate it into the current woodland carbon code?
Not yet. It's not just agroforestry as well. They were looking at, Clive's mentioned the hedgerow code, the peatland code are expanding what they're allowing for the generation of carbon credits. Soil carbon codes are all being developed. So at the minute, Clive and team presented it to our executive board last week. We've just got to make sure we go through all those steps to make sure that it is all as credible as it can be, really. And one of the things that's kind of we're just keeping our eye on as well at the moment for our own internal use and for the agroforestry carbon code potentially is looking at the different requirements of ICVCM, VCMI, all these different organisations that are looking at you need this to be able to generate carbon credits credibly. And so we just need to make that's all being published at the moment. So hopefully within the next couple of months we'll have a better idea as to, okay, well, can that slot in quite easily? And then you've got to look at practical terms. Okay, if we were to do that, how do you apply a common practice test additionality-wise to one part of the farm and then a financial test to another, but then the peatland code do it slightly different? You can see that's the sort of question. And so I think it'll be the likely timeline will link very closely to the development of a whole farm carbon assessment. Once that, and for a carbon market perspective, once we have that in place, we'll be in a far better position to move forward. So it's going to be at least 6 months a year, just, it's not imminent at the minute.
I'm Manuela. I'm a consultant at Ricardo. The question I have actually isn't about carbon specifically. So the last talk I went to was on functional biodiversity, and something that they were highlighting then was how agroforestry can reduce the number of pests that you have and therefore reduce input costs of pesticides, and then sometimes have impacts on the general productivity of the farm as well. And I might just not have noticed this, but I didn't see that quantified financially in the case study pilots that you've done, and I wondered if you had any updates on what that looked like financially for the whole farm.
I'll just respond to that quickly. Of course, there are many other potential benefits, financial revenue saving benefits, or even other markets that could be stacked on top of this. We were just looking at carbon. We didn't ignore those other things. We're just not funded to do any work on it. But if you read the full report, we completely acknowledge that sort of multiple benefits from these pilots and the system as a whole. So, final question.
Hello, Robert Barber from the Sustainable Food Trust. Thanks very much. I think this kind of links to an earlier question, but with the, I guess it's for Colin, but the Macpherson paper that you mentioned and their model around kind of more open grown trees, how relevant would that be to agroforestry systems which are perhaps based around, clumps of trees or broader swathes of trees with higher planting densities, as opposed to the kind of, lines of single trees or single standards being grown?
I will hand to the expert, but my initial sort of amateur response to that is, can the Woodland Carbon Code not handle a lot of those features currently? It might not make sense to include them in a project because there's not enough kind of clumps or individual areas, but if you started to combine it with the other things that we've been talking about, hedgerows, infield trees, woodlands, then maybe it starts to make more sense. But Colin, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, our methods are really for low density trees. If you had clumps of trees, if it conformed to the definition of a woodland, I would probably go to the Woodland Carbon Code and use their calculator. You'd have to flip between them. Yeah.
Okay, I sense we could probably go on for another half an hour, but we'd all be wilting by then. So if you could just final thanks to the speakers.
Thank you for listening. We'd like to thank our lead sponsor, Sainsbury's, and our other major sponsors, Farmers Weekly Transition, Forestry Commission, and Tilhill, and all the attendees for making this show such an overwhelming success. To get advice and support for your agroforestry project, either visit woodlandtrust.org.uk/plant or soilassociation.org/agroforestry.